Hello and welcome back to my kitchen. I'm Anissa and today we're making a very simple but very tasty cherry pie recipe. So let's just get right started. I have 350 grams of plain or all-purpose flour and I'm just going to add 1 teaspoon of salt. Now we're just going to stir that salt through. Next we're going to add 250 grams of unsalted fridge cold butter. Now the important thing about this, we're making a very short pastry for our pie, and that means you have to keep all of your ingredients as cold as possible. This will give you a much flakier pie. If you let that butter warm up, if anything in this gets too warm and that butter starts melting before it hits that oven, you're going to end up with a really tough pie crust instead of those beautiful flaky layers that you want to see in a pie recipe. So all I'm doing now is I'm just coating the butter in the flour so it doesn't melt as soon as it hits my fingers, and I'm just trying to use my fingertips to work that butter into the dough. So you're just sort of rubbing it into the dough. It might not look like I'm doing much right now, but you'll see in approximately 5 minutes it'll start to resemble breadcrumbs. If you feel like the butter's starting to melt, stop, put it back in the fridge for around 10 minutes until everything has chilled again, and then you can continue. I have rubbed my butter into the flour and you can see it's got this really nice breadcrumb consistency. You'll see some little flecks of butter here and there. That's perfectly good. It helps flake up your pastry really nicely. And now I'm going to try to work relatively quickly. We're just going to add a couple teaspoons of sugar. This is just going to give my pastry a slight bit of sweetness without being overly sweet. Next, I'm going to add 1 whole beaten egg. So I like to add 1 egg just because it gives my pastry that little bit of extra richness and flavour and colour. You can add a duck egg for extra richness, but I don't really have duck egg money, so we're sticking with the humble chicken egg. And what I like to do is just sort of slice that egg through with a knife, just so I can really keep my hands off it and keep it as cool as possible and get an idea for how much liquid I need to add. So I've got some ice cold water here. I've just added a couple of ice cubes to keep it as cold as possible, approximately 100 millilitres, and I'm just adding a little bit of that through and again cutting it in. I'm trying to work quite quickly. My kitchen is really warm, so everything's warming up quite quickly and we want this dough to stay nice and cold. So when you think it starts looking like it's a nice consistency, to me it reminds me a little bit of chewing gum at this point. I just sort of try to combine it all together like so. It's slightly wet at the moment because that water hasn't really absorbed too well yet, but I just sort of press it together, trying not to handle the dough too much. We don't want to overwork it and end up with a tough dough. And we're just going to sort of shape it together and you'll see it comes together quite nicely. Now at this point you'd rather add too much liquid than too little. You don't want a dry cracky dough, and it's always easier to work in extra flour instead of extra liquid later. So I promise you it will start to work together. I just sort of press it in, try not to overwork it. And when I have a bowl like this, I wrap it in cling film and I'm going to put this in the fridge until I'm ready to roll it out. So I've wrapped my dough really well with cling film. This is not a skippable step. If you're in a hurry to make this dough, make it the night before if you need to, which is basically what I'm doing today. I'm making my ingredients ahead of time and put this in the fridge for at least half an hour. An hour would be ideal. So now we're going to start making our cherry pie filling. I have 1 kilo of cherries which have been pitted in this pan. I am using frozen cherries today. Sweet cherries, sweet, nice, fresh cherries aren't always available here and they're ridiculously expensive, so these are a really good substitute. But if you're using fresh, you can follow the exact same instructions that I'm going to show you now. So to these cherries, I'm going to add half a lemon. It just helps really bring out the flavours of those cherries, and any sort of fruit dessert that I make, I always add a little bit of lemon juice to that. It just really helps elevate those fruits. Next, I'm just going to add some sugar. I don't really have a precise measurement for this. I mean, it's always going to depend on how sweet your fruit actually is. So I do like to give it a taste before I finish cooking it, just to make sure that the sweetness is quite right. And I'm also going to add about a tablespoon of cornstarch. This is just going to help your pie thicken up without being overly runny by the end. I'm also going to add 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract and a little pinch of salt. I've just decided I think I'll add 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract just because I have quite a lot of cherry here and I do want it to come through. I'm now going to cook these cherries on a medium-high heat. Just keep it stirring quite frequently. You don't want your fruits to start burning, especially with the sugar and the cornstarch in this pan. And we're just going to keep cooking it until it just starts to thicken up. So my cherries have been cooking approximately 5 minutes. I did lower the heat once it just started simmering and just let it continue cooking like that, and it's thickened up quite nicely, and this is exactly where you want it to be. As it bakes in the oven, it will release a lot more liquid, so you're not going to end up with a super dry pie. Taste one of your cherries. Just make sure that the sweetness is right and everything in there is just how you want it. And now we're going to leave this to cool entirely. So whilst my cherries are cooling, I'm going to prepare my pastry. I actually made this the night before, so it's going to be very, very hard to work with. And I'm just cutting this. I'm leaving just over half, which is going to be the base of our pastry. And the remaining quarter that we have is going to get covered up and go back into the fridge until we're ready to work with that, and that's going to form the lid of our pie. And whilst it's very cold, it's going to be kind of impossible to roll out, so what I do is I just start by pressing it down, and eventually it does start to work with you. And as I go, I do try to remold it just as I go, as it just starts to soften up and work with me, and just carry on, press. Whew, it's hard work. So I'm still pressing and remolding. I'm just giving it the occasional turn here and there. Where it starts to crack, it will, I promise you, it will really start to come together as this becomes a bit more pliable. And I like to work on a baking sheet just because it makes it much easier to transfer to my pie dish later. So it is slowly becoming a bit more pliable, and I'm able to just roll it a little more, and I'm just giving it the odd turn here and there. If you feel at any point like your dough is starting to warm up, stick it back in the fridge for around 10 minutes. I've greased it with a little butter, and this is the part that always stresses me out, trying to figure out how I'm going to transfer this pie. So my technique changes every time, so I think this time I'm going to try a little sort of flip and pray for the best. And I'd say that's well enough, and we can just sort of lift carefully and let it just sort of drop back in until we get it in place. So I have my dish here. I just sort of reworked it a little. Where it was a little patchy, I just tore off the overhang and just sort of pressed it into place. So I'm just going to spoon my cooled filling into my pastry. I did spread it out on a tray just to help it cool down a little faster. I'm just going to spread that nice and evenly. And I'm just adding some little flecks of butter just for that little bit of extra flavour. So I've rolled the lid into a very rough circle. And you know, I'll tell you now, I never roll out the prettiest shapes for my pies, but the final result always turns out. What I do is with a pizza cutter, I just cut these into relatively even strips, and this is just going to form the, well, we're going to make a nice little lattice shape for the lid of our pie. I'm just going to sort of try to layer these on. Some of them, well, I didn't size this up brilliantly, but it'll do. I'm just trying to get the longest ones in the middle and then the shorter pieces around the edges. And we're just going to peel back some of these and layer some of our pie dough across to help create that lattice shape. Again, it doesn't matter if it's cracking, you can always smooth those out a little later. And And it doesn't matter too much if it breaks. Again, it's very workable, very forgiving. And then you go with the next layer. And your next piece of pie dough goes across. And back over. And then you go back to your original. And you just continue like so until all your pie dough has been used up. Now what I do like to do is these little overhangs that we get around here, I just sort of fold them over with our excess dough. And what I like to do with these excess overhangs that you can see here is I like to form a sort of crimp. So I don't know how well you can see this. I basically pass two fingers, like my thumb and my index, and then my other index I just sort of push like so. So it's just so I can follow the sort of crimped design of my pie dish, and it just helps smooth out any of those final imperfections in your dough and just make it look that little bit prettier. And now we're just going to give this a final egg wash, and this is just going to help give your pie a really beautiful golden colour when it comes out. So I've given this an egg wash, and I'm just going to sprinkle it with a little sprinkle of sugar, just for that final bit of caramelised goodness when this finishes baking. So this is going to go into a 200 degrees Celsius preheated oven for around 20 minutes, just until we sort of get an initial cooking of that crust, and then we're going to reduce the temperature. So my cherry pie has been baking at 200 degrees Celsius for around 20 minutes, and I've just reduced the temperature to around 170 degrees Celsius, just so it can give those fruits a good chance to cook, and we're going to remove it from the oven when they start bubbling up quite nicely. And if you find that the outside of your pastry just starts to brown a little too fast for you, you can just cover the edges with either a pie protector, which I don't have. I just use a bit of foil and cover those edges, but just keep an eye on it, and once you've reduced the temperature, it should take approximately 40 to 50 minutes. So I've just removed my pie from the oven. It took approximately an hour after I turned down the temperature, and you can see the cherries really nicely bubbling through, and this is a really good sign that it's cooked. Now you're just going to want to leave it to cool entirely. This could take about a couple hours, 2 to 3 hours. And that's all there is to it, my imperfect, perfect cherry pie. You can see the pastry has really flaked up nicely in these little layers, and that's where all that butter has really just helped to puff up those different layers of my pastry. It's super crispy, like you can hear and I think it's going to be delicious. You can smell the vanilla, you can smell the butter, and it's a really easy recipe. That's all there is to it. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment on the video, and any suggestions for the future would be really appreciated. Thank you for watching.